So is the hearing the main mechanism by which things get done in oversight, or are there other kinds of meetings or places where a whole committee will go and be informed about what's happening with a particular part of the executive branch?
For the committee staff, the hearing is an important but a small piece of the oversight process. I spent much more time, hours and hours with GAO, trying to understand the history behind different issues and the why. Why are things the way they are today? Why were they set up this way? What the hearing does is allow you to build a record for a legislative fix, or to extract commitments from the executive branch on actions that Congress wants them or expects them to take to address an issue. So as we would take on the oversight hearings, we often had in mind some kind of a legislative attempt to address whatever the issue was. And it wouldn't necessarily be full solution, but to make positive progress on solving some of these problems. But it's best practice, frankly, to have some legislative history behind behind bills, right? It doesn't always happen. There are a lot of bills that get moved without legislative history, but people go back and look to understand, what did Congress intend? What does the hearing record show? I frequently in my work will go back decades to hearings and or committee reports and try to find what the intent behind Congress's actions were. And that's what you get from a hearing that you don't get from all of the other oversight activity and the meetings and all of that, unless it's pulled into the hearing record. So that's the real benefit there. And that's a nice nod to the value of transparency too, because it makes these things available to people in the future who want to go back, or a solution that might have worked 20 years ago isn't working anymore. So being able to go back in time, figure out what the considerations were there, and then bring that to the current day as you're trying to find solutions is incredibly helpful.
Yeah, I would think that when it comes to oversight, if you define oversight in a narrow sense of, is the executive branch executing on the laws, right? And there's some problem comes in, I guess there's a couple of theoretical problems that could be happening. One is that the law is impossible to execute, right? Another is that it's possible to execute, but it's not being managed well by some individual or group of individuals, right? So it's a management problem versus an impossible legislation kind of problem. So how does that concept get teased out, right, during this process?
Well, one of the things we try to do is to make sure Congress is educated on the agencies that it's overseeing. And we created, over the past year, we're calling them agency oversight snapshots, but it's a very visually friendly, lots of graphics snapshot of different indicators of the health of some of these departments. We looked at the CFO Act agencies. We'd love to do this for more agencies. Don't have the capacity to do more right now, but we're thinking about what else we can do. But we try to pull in information about the demographics of the agencies, the age of the workforce, the diversity of the workforce, the people in senior positions who are retiring, the best places to work rankings of that department, the GAO high-risk areas, open IG recommendations, customer service metrics where they exist. All of those to make sure that Congress has as much information at its disposal in a quick and easy to digest format, so they could at least have a baseline understanding of the department. We also have the mission statement of the department, like what does it do and where is it located? Where are the major components of this agency? Why is that valuable? Because to your point, there could be a mission that Congress will give an agency that they can't execute on because they don't have the people in that area, or they don't have the internal expertise. They need recruitment tools to bring people in who are able to execute. An example of this would be, several years ago, 10 years ago now, stimulus bill included a provision to create more green buildings, LEED certified in green buildings, which is great. But the people who were actually working on the like HVAC and the systems within federal buildings knew how to operate boiler systems. They had not been trained. So there had to be a separate piece of legislation passed to help them bring in and train people who would be able to execute on this new mission, which made a lot of sense to everybody. But it's those things that get overlooked. So what we try to do is make sure that Congress is asking itself, whatever the policy is, does this agency have the people? Does this agency have the technology? Does it have the systems in place to allow it to execute on the mission we're giving them? And to do so in collaboration with other agencies and other departments, because very few challenges facing government today are within the control of any one department. Most of them are crossing agency silos, and it just demands that agencies are collaborating. We don't have to look any farther than response to the pandemic and the effort to get the vaccine out as quickly as possible. How many agencies are actually involved in that? It's really quite extraordinary.
Yeah. So when I think about oversight, and you talk about your kind of cheat sheet for the committee, in my experience, at least on the business side, is I think of it more as a board of directors in a room, and you've got a huge, wall full of data coming from all those different constituencies, and it being prioritized, and you can go through one by one. Is it the constituents say X, the employees say Y, the leaders say Z, and then walking through that in a systematic basis on every month, say, where you have some expert presenting and you can ask questions back and forth. It sounds like you're taking the first step towards that kind of a system, with at least making sure that the committee members know the basics about that agency.
We're trying. I love thinking about it that way, and we're trying. The challenge is that it's a very crowded day every day for everyone up there, and so trying to find ways to get information to people who can use it in real time and make it easily accessible is probably the bigger challenge. Like, how can we make sure that they know what's available, and that when an issue arises or something is now on the radar that needs immediate attention, how can we shorten their learning curve? And this is especially true when we have fewer and fewer congressional staffers who are highly tenured. We know that a lot of people at mid-career are starting to leave the Hill, which is something I never thought I would see, but it's happening now. And so how can we make sure that people at all levels of their career, whether they're tenured or whether they're many of the people who are in their first year or two of a Hill job, have access to information that is easy to understand and easy to operationalize and apply?
Yeah, and I guess the final question I have, at least on the oversight side, is the way that it's organized in Congress. Obviously, you have your committee and your subcommittee that are focused on particular parts of the executive branch. Is that the logical way? Is it divvied up properly? Do you have some committees that have half the government and others that have, less than 1%? What's your thought on the way that should be organized?
I am not a fan of massive overhaul of the committee system. And it's been done in pieces here and there, notably when the Department of Homeland Security was created. Everybody is very familiar with the challenges that came along with that while there was a committee created, and then my old committee assumed jurisdiction. Other committees retained jurisdiction over pieces of the department as it was put together, and that was part of the negotiation and the sausage making, if it were. But I think what's more important than the stated jurisdiction or reorganizing is making sure that the members on those committees have knowledge and understanding of the agencies that they oversee, and are able to carve out the time necessary to develop some level of fluency in what they're working on. So I think it's less about reorganizing the committees and thinking more about how we onboard members to the committees and make sure that they're getting a steady diet of information that is useful and relevant and going to help them be more effective.
Great. Well, let's move on to this executive branch Congress kind of information connection. We've talked about it in relation to oversight, but I think you've been involved in a wider array of kind of communication. Can you tell us a little bit how that works? How does the executive branch really communicate with Congress, either in terms of bringing legislative ideas or priorities, or whether it's listening to what the Congress is saying? How does that dialogue happen? I think most people don't really have an understanding of that.
Well, Congress has a real interest in what's happening inside the agencies, yet few members of Congress have actually been to an agency headquarters or talked to the people working inside the agencies. The conversations typically happen at the senior level or staff to staff level, where the Congressional Affairs Office in the agency or department acts in some way as the gatekeeper. So one of the things we would love to see is additional free-flowing information and a chance for members of Congress to actually go and visit these agencies. Mark Meadows and Jerry Connolly, Mark Meadows when he was a Republican member of Congress from North Carolina, Jerry Connolly still a member of Congress, a Democratic from Virginia. They both have made a point of visiting federal agencies and talking to the workforce, the career people, not through legislative affairs, but to learn more about what they do and what their challenges are. And that's an incredibly valuable way for them to round out the information they get through official channels, which would be the president's budget request and responses to congressional letters. Departments are always receiving letters from members of Congress on different issues or asked to do a report on something. There are hundreds and hundreds of reports that agencies have to submit to Congress every year. Many of those are public. A few of them are not public. There's an effort to make more of them public, and I think that would be a good thing. But augmenting all of that is a chance to have conversations. So the information flow now is through official channels, but there are also unofficial channels that are very helpful. And sometimes it's beneficial to just have a leader pick up the phone and call another leader. I had a really interesting conversation with a former deputy secretary of a department who said that his committee of jurisdiction wanted to hold a hearing on something. It didn't make any sense to him. He thought it was a non-issue, and he basically ignored the request to testify until he was, mind you, this is not someone who'd ever served in Congress before. So if he had or had been a staffer, he might have had a different approach, but he basically ignored the committee until he got a subpoena. So he called the chairman and they had a conversation, and he was able to get them what they needed. And it really just took a phone call. So fostering personal relationships between the branches and between the leaders is, I think, an essential way to augment the official channels that exist, because really, if you want to solve problems and get meaningful information, it's going to happen when there is some trust, when there is an understanding about objectives and goals, and there are the relationships that allow that to occur.
And subpoenas.
And subpoenas, the threat of subpoena.
Right. Great. Well, why don't we move on to some of the questions that I ask all the guests on the program. With a couple of standard questions, I'd like to get your personal opinion on some of these. Are you ready?
Sure, happy to. Yeah, I'm ready.
All right, great. Well, my first one is, what do you think congressional representation should mean?
I think congressional representation should mean representatives who are solving problems that matter for our public, but also who are being good stewards of the institution of Congress. If they only come to Congress worried about their district and their constituents and not the country as a whole and not the institutions that uphold our democracy, it's going to be very hard for them to see the point of view of their colleagues or to reach compromise with their colleagues. So I believe it means a combination of representing your district well, but understanding that That district is part of a larger country with democratic institutions that serve all, and finding a way to bring all of that together to solve meaningful problems.
So on the district side, when you say represent their districts, there are the two ways of thinking about that. One is the district's beliefs. People have their beliefs in that district, and the representative can reflect those beliefs directly. Or he can think about his district's long-term interest, and he can vote what his judgment is on what he thinks is the long-term interest of that district. So where do you fall on that spectrum? I think I understand. I think I know from your previous answer, but I'd like to hear you talk about that.
One of the reasons I think, excuse the ringing phone, one of the reasons I think it's so important for members of Congress to learn more about our government and the government in which they are serving as stewards and leaders is because they're going to be called upon to make judgment calls and to use their judgment on behalf of the people that they're serving. And I strongly feel that there's no way that there's so many issues that come before Congress, and some of them are difficult and challenging. And it requires an understanding and breadth of exploration and information to make an informed decision. It's not possible for the public to, in every case, to be able to just, answer a poll question and for the member to, make the right call every time. So I think people are well served by sending people who have good judgment and a willingness to learn the job and execute the job effectively.
Great. My next question is, how would your ideal Congress allocate its time?
I would love to see a Congress and individuals in Congress who spend more time on the routine oversight issues that we were talking about, on developing relationships with their colleagues, but also with their colleagues in the executive branch, with leaders in the executive branch, and really learning about the institution in which they're serving. Congress is an incredible place with an amazing history. I love the institution. And sometimes I wonder how much the members who are serving there really have time to think about what an incredibly special place it is and how important it is to preserve it as a democratic institution that really is the underpinning of our entire democracy. So I would like them to have more time to learn and reflect and build relationships. I know that the amount of money that they have to raise in order to run for re-election is very high, and that requires fundraising activities pretty much every week for their entire term. Most members of Congress I've talked to don't like having to raise that much money. They don't enjoy that. So I don't have a solution and then I'm not trying to get into a campaign finance conversation, but I know that many members of Congress would love to devote the time they must spend to raising money to other activities.
So if you had to break it down with percentages, oversight versus legislation versus other kinds of activities.
I'm not going to answer that question because I don't think it's a static answer. I mean, there are going to be times where we need several committees involved in oversight. I think just look at the COVID response. It's going to require, I hope, a very heavy oversight activity on the part of multiple committees before we can fix some of the flaws that we've seen in the federal and just the national response to COVID. There are going to be times where it's heavier on legislation, times where it's heavier on oversight. I think that there's a close to healthy, I might retract that. I think the balance is not in favor of good policy making right now. I think there's too much on the politics and the messaging and the fundraising that is detracting from the real reason they're there.
So more percentage towards legislation and oversight than other activities.
Yes, I'll give you that. I'll answer that. Yes.
So how about out of Washington versus in Washington?
I think it matters what relationships they have, and they are accountable to their districts and their voters. So I don't begrudge them having a district work period. There's this misconception that that's vacation For some, it might be vacation, and we've seen a little bit of that in the news. But, by and large, they have a lot of, some of them, especially some of the members who represent more rural area, huge territory to cover. So even traveling within their district or their state is very time consuming, and they need that time to connect with their district. But I think what's far more important is having meaningful working relationships. By keeping them locked in Washington, it doesn't guarantee that those meaningful relationships are developing. I think some great relationships have been fostered by virtue of the fact that through Zoom or other platforms, they're actually able to participate in each other's district events or different things that otherwise wouldn't have been possible. So I think what's more important is their productivity, their relationships, their desire to learn than how much time they're in Washington or not.
Great. Next question is, how should debate, deliberation, or dialogue occur or be structured in Congress?
I would love to see more conversation in the committees. And I've been privileged to be part of what some committees describe as a legislative roundtable instead of a hearing. And I found those to be incredibly productive conversations. So rather than the traditional dais where members are raised and you have the witness table down below, everyone's sitting around the table together, witnesses and members, and they're having a conversation. They can react to each other and what they say. The witnesses can react to each other in real time. And those have been some of the most fruitful, substantive conversations that I've been part of. So I would love to see, as a general practice, a little bit more of the roundtable format. I don't know what we'll see post-COVID. I mean, governments and Congress are fundamentally different places today than they were before the pandemic. So knowing what the current practices will stick and what won't, I'm not sure. But I think if we can encourage conversation, ideally in-person conversation, and not just with people of their own party or on their own side of an issue, but with a variety of viewpoints, that will yield better relationships and better policy outcomes.
Do you see those best done in a private setting or with the cameras on?
I think it's probably a mix. There are going to be times, I'm sure, you've probably had other guests comment on this, where some of the conversation, in order to be candid and to have those breakthroughs, it needs to happen outside of an open environment where people have the glare of the spotlight on them. I think by and large, I support as many congressional hearings as possible being open to the public, open for people to see and to learn and to find ways to engage with their members of Congress and make their views known. So I'm generally in favor of openness, recognizing that there are times where to get the breakthrough, there might need to be a private conversation.
Great. So what fundamental institutional improvement should Congress make within 50 years?
Gosh, well, I hope it doesn't take 50 years for Congress to do more to effectively onboard new members of Congress and to provide constant and consistent opportunities for learning that are valued and not something to skip because you don't have time, but something that's both available and something that members will perceive helps them do their job better. I think there are really positive movements I'm seeing in this direction. So I hope those are fruitful. I also think it's essential to have a more diverse workforce in Congress and for people to feel like the people representing them both reflect their interests, but also represent their interests, so that we have a Congress that looks like America, but also takes up the issues that matter for a variety, really for all people, not just issues that are important to people who have political power. And again, I think we're tracking in the right direction, although there's a lot of work to be done.
Great. What book or article most shaped your thinking with respect to congressional reform?
Oh, I'm going to give you two. One is Profiles in Courage. I read it when I was a brand new congressional staffer, And I still think about, I've not reread it in a long time, but I'd like to do so because I reflect on the number of members of Congress who I have great respect for, who are leaving the institution or have left the institution. And it's a good reminder for me that sometimes to vote against your political interest or to speak against your political interest, but because it's core to your values, like that takes courage. And I admire that. And I want to do whatever I can to foster that in the people who are working there, to really feel that there's nothing more important than their values and the values of the country that they serve, and to put that above their political interests. And that's why I like Profiles in Courage. More currently, they're very recently updated by the amazing Molly Reynolds, Vital Statistics on Congress, is one of my favorite resources. I have it bookmarked. I'm always going to it for insights on, whether it's the number of women serving or the number of days in session. Like, how do you overlay all these incredibly interesting data points to extract the insights that really help you understand the institution and how it's working or where it could work better? So I'm a huge fan of that. It's a big labor of love by Molly and her colleagues, and just think it's a terrific resource.
Great. Well, the last question is around, the plans for the partnership and for yourself in the short term and in sort of in the longer term. Where are your interests? Where do you want to focus the resources and attention?
Well, our organization is about making government work better and helping build the critical connections to enable that. And that could mean helping executive branch leaders work better together, work better with state and local governments, but it also means helping Congress and executive branch work together effectively on actual problems, having real share of meaningful information, not talking points and marketing materials, but really getting into where we can all move the needle collectively to serve the public better. And I'm very encouraged by this work. And I think we will be increasingly focused more on how Congress itself is operating and how we can help Congress be that steward of the executive branch and be the steward of its own institution in ways that are going to sustain it for the foreseeable, for forever. We don't want it to ever go out. So that's what's next for us. A lot more work in the space.
Great. Well, Kristine, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. This was a pleasure.